Relapse autopsy. That's the term the substance abuse treatment industry has long used to describe the process of reviewing the history and patterns of a person who had a period of sobriety followed by a return to use. It's an unfortunate term. I don't particularly love either word. Autopsy implies failure. Relapse often carries shame. I suspect our field will eventually evolve language that is more nuanced, more clinically accurate, and less loaded with moral undertones. But for now, the phrase still points towards something important: the need to carefully examine how a person moved from stability back toward unhealthy coping. When clients complete a relapse autopsy, they often identify their sobriety date, the triggering event, the stressor, the conflict, or the specific moment they returned to drinking or substance use or other unhealthy coping. This is essential, useful, necessary, but it is also incomplete because the most clinically important information usually exists much earlier in the process. If you've spent any time in recovery communities, whether that's 12-step recovery, smart recovery, any of the alternatives, professional treatment, therapy, coaching, or some other recovery-centered environment, you've probably heard the phrase, relapse is a process, not an event. That statement is absolutely true. But I think the depth of that truth is often underestimated. Most people focus on the last straw, the argument, the breakup, the work crisis, the grief, the unexpected trauma, the business pressure, the loneliness. Finally, the drink. But triggers only become dangerous when the underlying structure is already weakened. A strong foundation can absorb stress. A compromised foundation cannot. And that distinction matters because most people do not suddenly wake up one morning and decide to destroy their recovery. Instead, they slowly drift away from the habits of being, thinking, and doing that support emotional regulation, resilience, connection, and psychological stability. That drift often happens quietly, subtly, gradually enough that people normalize it while it's happening. This is why when I work with clients, I encourage them to reverse engineer their return to problematic coping all the way back to the earliest signs of structural instability, not the final trigger. The earlier shifts, the architecture changes, the cracks in the foundation, the subtle movement away from healthy coping and back towards the unhealthy toolbox. And importantly, I want clients identifying these signs before they ever pick up a drink again. That's the real work. Because the earlier we identify movement towards unhealthy coping, the easier it is to intervene. Once someone reaches the later stages of a relapse vulnerability, biology and psychology both begin working against them. Sleep deteriorates, stress hormones increase, isolation often increases, impulsivity increases, healthy routines have weakened, mood regulation worsens, and eventually the brain begins moving towards the coping strategy it has historically learned provides the fastest relief. That is why relapse prevention is not simply avoiding alcohol or even people, places, and things. It's about protecting the overall structure that supports healthy living. Or said differently, recovery is not just about removing alcohol. It's about building a life an architecture sturdy enough that alcohol no longer has to function as survival equipment or stress management. I'll use myself as an example. I know that when my stress becomes unmanaged, my sarcasm increases, my irritability increases, my negative first reactions to life become less filtered. I begin narrowing my social connectedness. I become more isolated while simultaneously justifying it with language like, I just need to decompress. I need space. I need to be alone. I'm an introvert. Later in the process, I may notice poorer sleep, more impulsive spending, emotional exhausting, less capacity, decreased patience, and less intentional self care. Now, my followers know that I have not returned to use in 35 years, but that does not mean I have never moved closer to unhealthy coping. And that distinction is what is incredibly important. Recovery is not binary. People are not constantly People are constantly moving toward healthier coping or unhealthier coping. The movement matters, the patterns matter, the architecture matters, because those earlier shifts are what position people to become vulnerable to the later stage trigger. By the time someone says, I don't know what happened, a great deal has usually already happened. Psychologically, emotionally, behaviorally, relationally, and biologically. I've observed some common early warning signs in clients, and these include increased irritability, increased anger, increased road rage, emotional numbing, chronic avoidance, disordered eating, compulsive overworking, returning to process addictions like gambling, sex, spending, increased secrecy, abandonment of structure and routine, not taking prescribed medications, decreased sleep hygiene, social withdrawal, cynicism, and escalation of untreated mental health symptoms. And here's the difficult truth. Many of these behaviors are culturally normalized, especially among professionals and executives. Overworking is praised. Isolation gets reframed as needing space. Burnout becomes drive. Emotional shutdown becomes professionalism. Chronic stress becomes success. But when those patterns accumulate long enough, they erode the internal structure that supports sustainable recovery. That erosion is what matters because eventually a trigger appears. That's just life. And the trigger gets blamed for the relapse, when in reality, the trigger simply landed on an already compromised foundation. Let me conclude with another personal example. About 13 years ago, I was in a near fatal car accident. I was in and out of consciousness while first responders used the jaws of life to extract me from the vehicle. By the time I arrived at a level 4 trauma center in Houston, I was unconscious and immediately they administered morphine, an entirely appropriate medical intervention given the level of trauma and anticipated pain. Now, we know opiates themselves carry addictive potential, and I know enough about my own history, biology, and vulnerability to understand that my body responds to psychoactive substances with craving potential. But context matters. At the time, I was not living from chronic unhealthy coping. I had supportive relationships, recovery structure, community, intentional habits, emotional support, managed depression, healthy routines, connection. Ironically, I was actually on my way to meet a peer in recovery for coffee when I was T-boned by the other car. So while the accident and the medication absolutely represented a potential trigger event, the larger foundation of my life was still stable enough to support healthy coping after it. And that's what matters clinically. Because if that same trauma had happened during a period of unmanaged stress, emotional isolation, chronic burnout, poor coping, and deteriorating structure, the outcome could have been very different. That's why I encourage people to examine recovery and relapse through a deeper lens. Not simply what triggered me, but instead, what changes were already happening in me long before the trigger arrived. Because sustainable recovery is rarely built in dramatic moments. It's built in the daily patterns of being, thinking, coping, connecting, resting, regulating, and living. It's built through structure. And if you are a professional or executive who recognizes yourself somewhere in this process, I currently have a limited number of openings for individuals who want to learn how to manage stress, strengthen their recovery, build a recovery architecture, and a life where alcohol is no longer carrying the weight of emotional survival.